December 4th, 1971/11:17 p.m. /Lenox Lounge, Harlem, New York. The call that broke the king of Harlem didn't come from the feds or a rival crew. It came with news that a greedy bastard had put his hands on a god. They had taken Joe Louis. Ellsworth, Bumpy Johnson held the black Bakelite receiver of the lounge's private phone so tightly his knuckles were white bone against aged skin. The low thrum of the jazz quartet in the main room, the clink of ice in whiskey glasses, the murmur of a Saturday night. It all faded into a dull, distant roar, like the sound of the ocean heard from inside a tomb. On the other end of the line, his man Frankie was stammering, his voice thin and reedy with panic. Bumpy, they walked right into his suite at the Waldorf. Said they was room service. His wife, Martha, she's hysterical. They took him, Bumpy. Just took him. Bumpy's world, a universe built on meticulous control, on the cold calculus of power and violence, tilted on its axis. Joe Louis wasn't just a boxer. He was a monument. He was the brown bomber, the man who had carried the hopes of every black man in America on his gloved fists and laid the myth of Aryan supremacy out cold on the canvas for the whole world to see. For Bumpy, who had watched those fights from smoky back rooms in Harlem, screaming himself hoarse with the rest of his people, Joe was something more. He was proof. Proof that a black man could be the strongest, the best, the most revered. He was dignity personified. And some punk, some gutter rat with more ambition than sense, had dared to put his filthy hands on him. He didn't speak. The silence stretched, thick and menacing. Frankie, mistaking the silence for disbelief, rushed to fill it. The cops are there now, but they ain't doing nothing. A skin questions, filling out papers. You know how they are. Martha said the man who took him, he was Italian. Short, fat guy. Left a message. Said he was holding the champ for a debt. A debt. The word was an obscenity. Joe's financial troubles were no secret. The man had made millions and had it all bled away by managers, taxes, and his own boundless generosity. Bumpy himself had helped, quietly, for years. A few thousand here, a comp tab there. It was a matter of respect, an honor. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was desecration. Who? Bumpy's voice was a low growl, a sound from the bottom of a well. They're saying it's Carmine Volpe's work. The Vulture, they call him. A snake from the Bronx. Thinks he's a new boss. Makes his money preying on old debts, shaken down has-beens. Carmine Volpe. Bumpy knew the name. A nobody. A leech who operated in the shadows of the real families, too insignificant to warrant serious attention. Until now, Volpe had mistaken a lion's age for weakness. He had mistaken a monument for a piece of property. He had made the gravest error of his short, miserable life. Bumpy hung up the phone without another word. He stood motionless in the cramped, wood-paneled office, the smell of stale cigar smoke and old leather filling his lungs. For the first time in 30 years, the king of Harlem felt powerless. His empire of numbers, protection, and influence meant nothing if it couldn't shield the one man who stood above it all. He leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the wall, his eyes squeezed shut. A tremor started in his hands, a fine, unfamiliar shaking that had nothing to do with age and everything to do with a rage so pure and so profound it threatened to consume him. His driver and confidant, Junie Bird, opened the door a crack. "Boss? Everything all right?" Bumpy turned, and the look on his face stopped Junie cold. The usual mask of calm, unassailable authority was gone. In its place was a raw, naked agony, the look of a man whose church had just been burned to the ground. "Get the car," Bumpy rasped, his voice cracking. "Get everyone. Wake them up. Drag them out of bed. I don't care who they're with or what they're doing. Get them to the club. Now." He walked past Junie, his movements stiff, his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. As he stepped into the main room, the jazz music hit him like a physical blow. The laughter, the life, the careless joy of it all felt like a personal insult. He didn't stop. He walked straight through the heart of his kingdom, a ghost in his own palace, and out into the cold December night. The city lights of Harlem blurred through the tears welling in his eyes. He hadn't cried since his mother died. He was crying now. For Joe. For the violation of something he had believed was untouchable. Witness testimony, Junie Bird. Recorded February 12, 1983. I'd been with Mr. Johnson for 15 years. Seen him face down hitmen, seen him stare down the commission, seen him walk into a federal courthouse like he owned the damn place. I never, not once, saw him scared. But that night, that wasn't fear. It was something deeper. It was like watching a priest see the cross get spit on. When he came out of that office, his face was gray. The only other time I saw that color on him was the day they carried him out of Wells' restaurant. He looked broken. He got in the back of the caddy and didn't say a word all the way back to his place on St. Nicholas. He just stared out the window at Harlem, at his Harlem, like he was seeing it for the last time. Like he'd failed it. When we got to his building, he just sat there for a minute. Then he looked at me, and his eyes were old. So damn old. He said, "Junie, this ain't about money. This is about history. And that son of a bitch is trying to erase it." I knew then this wasn't going to be a negotiation. This was going to be a war. December 5th, 1971/2:48 a.m. Bumpy Johnson's apartment, St. Nicholas Avenue. The apartment was a fortress of silent grief. Mamie, his wife, had made him a plate of food he hadn't touched. It sat on the dining room table, cold and forgotten. Bumpy stood by the window, looking down at the sleeping city. He had assembled his lieutenants. The word was out on the street. Bumpy was looking for Carmine, the vulture Volpe, and he was paying top dollar for any information. Every numbers runner, every dope dealer, every pimp and prostitute from the Battery to the Bronx was now an informant. His entire network, a finely tuned machine of illicit enterprise, was now singularly focused on one goal: find Joe Louis. A call came in around 3 in the morning. A junkie informant, desperate for a fix, claimed he'd seen Volpe's men hustle an old black man into a tenement basement on 148th Street. The address was a known shooting gallery. Bumpy's blood ran cold. The thought of Joe, the heavyweight champion of the world, in a place like that, it was unthinkable. This was the false alarm, the first twist of the knife. "Are you sure?" Bumpy's voice was lethally calm over the phone. "Yeah, man, I'm sure," the junkie whined. Big old guy, slow moving. They was rough with him. It was him, Bumpy, I swear it. This was phase 2, the emotional collapse under pressure. Desperation made him sloppy. He didn't wait for confirmation. He grabbed his coat. "Junie, let's go. Get 4 of the boys. No noise. We go in quiet." They descended on the tenement like wraiths. The building stank of urine, boiled cabbage, and despair. Bumpy led the way, his hand gripping the cold steel of a .38 in his coat pocket. They kicked in the basement door and found not a boxing legend, but a terrified old numbers runner named Pops, who'd fallen behind on his payments to one of Volpe's enforcers. The man was gagged and tied to a chair, his eyes wide with terror. The junkies who had been using the space scattered like rats. Bumpy looked at the pathetic scene, at the shivering old man, at the squalor of the room, and the wave of relief that washed over him was immediately replaced by a fresh surge of fury. The false alarm hadn't lessened his desperation, it had magnified it. Every dead end, every wasted minute, was another moment Joe spent in the hands of a monster. He gave one of his men a $100 bill. "Get Pops home, and tell him his debt is paid." He walked back to the car, the cold night air doing nothing to cool the furnace in his chest. He was chasing shadows. Volpe was smarter than he'd given him credit for. He wasn't keeping Joe in any of his usual haunts. He was hiding him somewhere unexpected, somewhere off the grid. The search had just begun, and the clock was ticking. Joe Louis had a heart condition. He was an old man, prone to bouts of confusion. How long could he last under this kind of stress? December 5th, 1971/7:12 a.m. Wells Restaurant, Harlem. The sun rose over a city indifferent to the abduction of a king. Bumpy sat in his usual booth at Wells, a place that was more his office than his office was. He hadn't slept. His eyes were bloodshot, etched with a map of worry and rage. His entire inner circle was there. A council of war held over untouched plates of chicken and waffles. "We've squeezed every snitch from here to New Rochelle," one of his men, Finley, reported. "Nothing. Volpe's gone to ground. Him, his crew, the champ, they've vanished." "He can't vanish," Bumpy said, his voice a low rasp. "A fat Guinea bastard and the most famous Negro in America? They can't just disappear. Someone saw something. We're not looking in the right places." He stared into his coffee cup, the black liquid a mirror of his own dark thoughts. He was thinking about systems. The police were a system, and they were useless. They'd file their reports and move on. The Italian families were a system, and they wouldn't help. Volpe was a rogue, an embarrassment, but he was still one of theirs. Crossing that line would start a war they didn't want, not over a black man, not even Joe Louis. Bumpy's own network, his own system, was all he had, and it was failing. The tension was a living thing in the booth. His men watched him, waiting for the plan, for the decisive command that always came. But Bumpy was adrift. For the first time, he had no move. He was reacting, chasing, and losing. Then, Junie Bird slid a copy of the Daily News across the table. It wasn't on the front page. Page 6. A small column, barely a footnote. Boxing grade in debt dispute. The article was vague, citing an anonymous source about a misunderstanding between Lewis and business associates. It painted Joe not as a victim, but as a deadbeat. Bumpy read the words, and a cold, clarifying rage settled over him. This was Volpe's plan. It wasn't just about the money. It was about humiliation. He was using the press to strip Joe of his dignity before he even made his ransom demand. He was turning a kidnapping into a sordid little business affair. He was trying to shrink a giant down to his own pathetic size. "This is how we find him," Bumpy said, his voice suddenly clear and hard as diamond. He tapped the newspaper. "This is the Vulture's mistake. He's proud of this. He's talking, not to us, but to his own kind. He's bragging." He turned to Finley. "I want you to find out which reporter wrote this. Find out who his source was. I want you to go to every social club, every bar, every restaurant in the Bronx where Volpe's crew drinks. You're not going to ask about Joe Louis. You're going to listen for whispers about the newspaper story. You're going to listen for some punk bragging about how his boss has the great Joe Louis in a cage and is making him look like a chump in the papers. Somebody is talking. Find him." The order was given. The machine had its direction. The hunt was on again, but this time it wasn't blind. They were hunting for an echo. The echo of a scumbag's pride. The countdown had entered a new, more desperate phase. December 6th, 1971/1:35 p.m. / a social club in Belmont, the Bronx. The lead came from a low-level bookie with a gambling problem and a loose tongue. Finley's men had found him in a dingy social club, running his mouth about his cousin, a button man for Carmine Volpe named Nicky, the Rat Costello. Nicky had been bragging the night before. Bragging about how they had the champ stashed somewhere no one would ever think to look. A place that was so out of the way, so forgotten, it was perfect. He'd let slip a name. Hart Island. Junie brought the news to Bumpy, who was holding court in the back of a Harlem tailor shop. Hart Island. Potter's Field. The city's graveyard for the unclaimed, the indigent, the forgotten. A sliver of land in the Long Island Sound, accessible only by a ferry controlled by the Department of Correction. It was a place of ghosts, a repository of nameless dead men. And Volpe had turned it into a prison for a living legend. The sheer, perverse poetry of it was sickening. It was a place you went to disappear forever. How? Bumpy asked, his mind racing. How did he get him on and off that island without anyone noticing? Volpe's got a cousin who works for the sanitation department, Junie explained. One of the guys who drives the morgue trucks that take the pine boxes out there. The bookie says Nicky was laughing about it. Said they put the champ in the back of the truck with the dead bodies. Sedated him. Drove him right through the gate. They've got him stashed in one of the old, abandoned hospital wards. Bumpy closed his eyes. He pictured Joe, sedated, confused, lying in the dark among the coffins of John Does, being smuggled to an island of the dead. The image was a physical violation. The systemic antagonist wasn't just Volpe anymore. It was the city itself. Its forgotten places, its corruptible civil servants, the cracks in the bureaucracy that a rat like Volpe could scuttle through. The plan formed instantly, born of necessity and righteous fury. They couldn't go in guns blazing. The island was city property, crawling with correction officers, however sparsely. A shootout would bring the whole world down on them and put Joe directly in the line of fire. "We need a boat," Bumpy said. "A fishing boat. Something that won't draw attention. And we need a doctor. Find Doc Hines. Tell him to pack a bag. Everything he might need for a man with a bad heart under extreme duress." He looked at Junie and Finley. "We go tonight. After dark. Just the three of us. We land on the South Shore, away from the ferry dock. We go in quiet, We get him, and we get out. No one sees us. No one knows we were there." He paused, his gaze hardening. "And Finley, I want you to take a crew and pay a visit to Nicky the Rat Costello. I don't want him dead. I want him to understand what happens when you laugh about putting Joe Louis in a box." This was it. The final act of the search. They had a location. They had a plan. Now, they were racing against the grim reality of what they might find in that forgotten place. They were on a rescue mission to the land of the dead. December 6th, 1971/9:47 p.m. / the shore of Hart Island. The winter wind coming off the Long Island Sound was brutal, sharp with the smell of salt and decay. It whipped at the three men as they dragged a small dinghy onto the muddy, litter-strewn shore of Hart Island. Bumpy, Junie, and Doc Hines moved in silence, shadows against the faint, distant glow of the city. The island was unnervingly quiet, the only sounds the rustling of brittle weeds and the mournful cry of a gull. In the distance, a single light burned near the ferry dock, but here, on the southern tip, was only darkness and the palpable weight of a million forgotten souls. They carried a single bag with medical supplies, a bolt cutter, and a flashlight. Junie had the layout of the old hospital wards, sketched on a napkin by the terrified bookie. They moved through the overgrown fields, past the small, numbered markers of the mass graves. Bumpy felt like a trespasser in a sacred, sorrowful place. He thought of the anonymous men, women, and children buried beneath his feet, and the anger inside him burned hotter. To bring Joe Louis here, to this place of ultimate obscurity, was an act of profound evil. They found the building easily, a collapsing two-story brick structure with boarded-up windows, a relic from when the island housed a psychiatric hospital, a sanatorium, a prison. It radiated a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather. Junie cut the rusted chain on a side door, and the screech of metal was obscenely loud in the silence. The air inside was thick and stagnant, heavy with the dust of decades, the smell of mildew and rot. Bumpy switched on the flashlight, its beam cutting a weak path through the darkness, illuminating peeling paint, overturned gurneys, and the spectral shapes of dust-covered furniture. It was a scene of absolute dereliction. They moved down a long corridor, their footsteps echoing. They checked room after room, each one empty, filled with debris and the ghosts of forgotten miseries. The beam of the flashlight was frantic now, a nervous tick in the oppressive dark. Doubt began to creep in. What if the bookie was wrong? What if they were too late? Then they heard it. A low moan. It came from behind a heavy, steel-reinforced door at the end of the hall. Junie put his shoulder to it. Locked. Solid. Bumpy pointed the flashlight at the heavy-duty padlock. There was no cutting this one. "Stand back," Bumpy whispered. He took out his .38, the one he had brought against his own orders, a concession to the unknown. He aimed carefully at the locked shackle, wrapped his hand and the gun in his thick wool coat to muffle the sound, and fired. The explosion was a deafening crack, a violent sacrilege in the dead quiet. The lock shattered. Junie kicked the door open. The flashlight beam swung into the room, and the sight that greeted them would haunt Bumpy Johnson for the rest of his days. The room was a small, tiled cell, likely an old isolation ward. There was no furniture, only a filthy mattress on the floor. A single, bare bulb hung from the ceiling, casting a weak, yellow light. And on the mattress, huddled in a corner, was Joe Louis. He was wearing the same clothes he'd been taken in, a fine suit, now rumpled and soiled. He was shoeless. An untouched plate of stale bread and a murky glass of water sat just out of his reach. But it was his face, his eyes, that stopped Bumpy's heart. They were wide, unfocused, and filled with a terror that was ancient and absolute. He was muttering to himself, his hands trembling. He looked frail, diminished, a giant shrunken by fear and neglect. He didn't seem to recognize them. He flinched away from the light, trying to press himself deeper into the corner, like a frightened animal. A few feet away, slumped in a chair, was one of Volpe's thugs, a young kid, barely 20, reeking of cheap whiskey and sound asleep with a shotgun across his lap. He was the sole guard. Bumpy felt a wave of nausea. This was the near-death discovery. Not a body riddled with bullets, but a spirit being systematically extinguished. They weren't just holding Joe Louis for ransom. They were breaking him. They were letting his mind, already fragile, unravel in the dark. Junie moved first. He crossed the room in 2 silent strides, lifted the shotgun from the sleeping guard's lap, and brought the butt of it down hard on the side of his head. The kid slumped over without a sound. Bumpy rushed to Joe's side, kneeling down on the filthy floor. "Champ," he said softly. "Joe? It's Bumpy. We're here to take you home." Joe Louis looked at him, but his eyes were vacant. He mumbled a name. "Max. Gotta watch out for Max Schmeling, his right hand." He was lost in the past, reliving a fight from more than 30 years ago. Doc Hines was already opening his bag. He checked Joe's pulse, listened to his heart with a stethoscope. He's severely dehydrated. Pulse is thready. The stress, his heart can't take much more of this. We need to get him out of here. Now, Bumpy took off his own overcoat and wrapped it gently around Joe's shoulders. The man who had once been the strongest in the world felt as fragile as glass. "It's all right, Joe," Bumpy whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's over now. Schmeling's gone. You won, remember? You won." He and Junie lifted him to his feet. Joe was unsteady, leaning heavily on them. As they guided him out of the room, Bumpy looked back at the unconscious guard, at the squalor, at the plate of bread on the floor. He saw Carmine Volpe's face in every detail. He saw the face of a new kind of evil, a dishonor so profound it had no place in the world, not even the underworld. The extraction was underway, but the rescue was far from over. As they stepped back into the cold, clean air of the island, Bumpy knew he wasn't just saving a man. He was saving a memory, a legacy, and he knew, with chilling certainty, that he would make Carmine Volpe pay for this desecration with everything he had. This was no longer business. This was a holy war. December 7th, 1971/1:12 a.m. / a safe house in Queens. The house was a modest, unassuming brick row house in a quiet neighborhood, owned by a doctor who owed Bumpy a life-altering favor. It was clean, anonymous, and far from the eyes of Harlem and the Bronx. They had brought Joe here, slipping through the city like ghosts. Now began the hardest part, the recovery. This wasn't a physical withdrawal from a drug. It was a torturous, 3-day descent into the hell of a traumatized mind. Joe Louis was adrift in a sea of paranoia and memory. He sat in a plush armchair in the living room, wrapped in a thick blanket, but he couldn't stop shivering. He refused to eat. He would drink water only after Bumpy drank from the same glass first. Doc Hines had given him a mild sedative, but it barely touched the deep-seated terror. For the next 72 hours, Bumpy Johnson did not leave his side. He became a caretaker, a guardian, a patient anchor in the champion's storm-tossed mind. He slept in a chair opposite him. He spoke to him in low, soothing tones, not about the kidnapping, but about the old days. He talked about the fights, about the crowds at Yankee Stadium, about the parades in Harlem. He became a curator of Joe's own greatness, trying to piece back together the hero that Volpe had tried to shatter. "Remember the Braddock fight, champ?" Bumpy would say, his voice soft in the quiet room. "They all thought you were too young. He caught you with that uppercut in the first round, put you down. But you got up. You always got up, Joe." Sometimes, Joe would seem to listen. A flicker of recognition in his eyes. He might nod, or whisper a name. "Chappie," he'd say, thinking of his legendary trainer, Jack Blackburn. But then the fog would roll back in. He'd stare at the windows, convinced men were watching him from the street. He'd accuse Doc Hines of trying to poison him. In the deepest hours of the night, he would weep, the silent, shoulder-shaking sobs of a strong man utterly broken. Bumpy watched it all, his heart an aching stone in his chest. This was the true cost of Volpe's crime. The physical neglect was nothing compared to this spiritual murder. He saw his own world reflected in Joe's suffering. He, too, was a king who had built an empire on strength and reputation. He saw how easily it could all be stripped away, leaving only a frightened, confused old man. It was a vision of his own potential future, and it terrified him more than any prison sentence or rival's bullet. Witness testimony, Junie Bird. Recorded February 12, 1983. "I'd bring food to the house. Coffee. The newspapers." Bumpy barely looked at me. His eyes were always on the champ. He looked, I don't know, humbled, like he was serving penance. One time, I came in, and Joe was having a bad spell, yelling about the Germans, thinking he was back in the war. He was scared, really scared. Bumpy didn't try to quiet him. He just sat on the floor in front of his chair, put his hand on Joe's knee, and said, "It's okay, soldier. We're on our side of the lines now. You're safe." He just kept saying it, over and over. "You're safe." He wasn't just talking to Joe Louis. I think he was talking to himself, too, trying to believe it. On the third day, something shifted. Bumpy was recounting the story of the second Schmeling fight, the one that meant everything. He described the electricity in the stadium, the roar of the crowd, the weight of the world on Joe's shoulders. 2 minutes and 4 seconds, Joe, Bumpy said, his voice resonating with the memory. That's all it took. You didn't just beat him. You annihilated him. You told the whole world who we were. You stood up for all of us. Joe Louis looked up. His eyes, for the first time in days, were clear. He focused on Bumpy's face. A long moment of silence passed. "Bumpy," he said. His voice was a dry, cracked whisper. Bumpy's breath caught in his throat. He nodded, a slow, grateful affirmation. "Yeah, champ. It's me. I'm thirsty," Joe said. Bumpy felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost brought him to his knees. He poured a glass of water and handed it to him. Joe took it with a steady hand and drank it all. He looked around the room, at the strange furniture, the drawn curtains. Where are we?" "You're safe, Joe," Bumpy said, his voice thick. "You're safe now." The fever had broken. The long nightmare was beginning to end. Doc Hines arranged for Joe to be admitted to a private psychiatric hospital upstate, a place for quiet recovery, far from the press and the vultures. The official story would be exhaustion, a nervous breakdown. The truth would be buried. But for Bumpy Johnson, the war was just beginning. He had rescued the king. Now he had to destroy the monster. He left the safe house in Queens and drove back to Harlem, the rising sun at his back. The vulnerability was gone, burned away by the fires of the last 3 days. In its place was a cold, hard certainty. He wasn't just a kingpin anymore. He was an instrument of vengeance. December 10th, 1971/11 p.m. / a warehouse in the Bronx. Carmine, the vulture, Volpe was not a smart man, but he was a cunning one. He knew holding Joe Louis was a death sentence if he got caught. His plan had been simple. Get a quick ransom from the champ's celebrity friends, humiliate the old man in the process, and bolster his own reputation. But Bumpy Johnson's sudden, silent, all-out war had spooked him. He'd gone to ground. Bumpy, however, didn't need to find Volpe. He just needed to make Volpe's world uninhabitable. Over the next 48 hours, he systematically dismantled Volpe's small-time empire. His top enforcers were arrested on anonymous tips. His number spots were hit. A fire broke out in the social club where he held court. Bumpy turned the city against him, using his influence with everyone from crooked cops to street corner hustlers. The final piece was Nicky the Rat Costello. After Finley's men were through with him, Nicky was more than willing to set up his boss. The meeting was arranged at a supposedly neutral warehouse in the Bronx. Volpe, desperate and cornered, walked right into the trap. He found Bumpy Johnson waiting for him, alone, standing in the center of the vast, empty concrete floor. "Bumpy," Volpe said, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. His 2 bodyguards fanned out behind him. "I hear you've been looking for me. We could have talked business." There was a misunderstanding with the old man. That's all. Bumpy didn't move. He just looked at Volpe with a quiet, profound contempt. "There are rules," Bumpy said, his voice calm, conversational. "Even for men like us. We don't touch civilians. We don't harm women. And we do not, under any circumstances, lay hands on a monument." "He owed me money," Volpe blustered. "You put him in a box with dead men," Bumpy continued, as if Volpe hadn't spoken. "You locked him in a dark room on an island of ghosts. You did that to Joe Louis. You didn't do it for money. You did it because you're a hyena. You wanted to feel big by making something great seem small." From the shadows along the warehouse walls, a dozen of Bumpy's men stepped out, armed with shotguns and tire irons. Volpe's bodyguards froze, their eyes wide. "This ain't about your life, Carmine," Bumpy said, taking a slow step forward. "You're not important enough for me to kill. This is about your world, your name, your future. As of tonight, you have none of those things. You will give every dollar you made from this to his wife, Martha. Then you will leave this city and never come back. If I ever hear your name again, if you are ever seen east of the Mississippi River, my people will find you, and they will bury you." Volpe, pale and sweating, looked at the silent, grim-faced men surrounding him. He looked at Bumpy's unyielding eyes. He knew it was over. He had broken the code, and this was the consequence. He nodded, a jerky, terrified motion. Bumpy turned and walked away without a backward glance. The violence was systemic, not personal. He wasn't a killer in this moment. He was a judge. He had restored order. But the justice of the streets comes with a price. An anonymous tip about an illegal weapons cache and a kidnapping plot, delivered in Carmine Volpe's panicked voice to the NYPD, led the authorities not just to Volpe's arsenal, but to Bumpy's men, who were in the process of escorting Volpe out of town. The ensuing bust swept everyone up. June 5, 1972/U.S. District Court, Foley Square. The trial was a farce. Volpe, given a deal, testified against Bumpy. He painted himself as a legitimate businessman and Bumpy as a violent thug. The kidnapping of Joe Louis was never mentioned. It didn't want the embarrassment of admitting a crime lord had to do the NYPD's job. Instead, they prosecuted Bumpy on conspiracy and weapons charges. He was convicted. The judge, making an example of the infamous Harlem kingpin, sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison. Leavenworth. Bumpy stood before the bench, impassive. He looked out at the courtroom and saw Mamie, her face a mask of stoic grief. He had won the war for Joe Louis's dignity, but he had lost his own freedom. He had upheld the code and would be caged for it by a system with no honor at all. As they led him away in chains, he felt a strange sense of peace. He had protected the monument. His own fate was secondary. July 1972 to November 1981/U.S. Penitentiary, Leavenworth, Kansas. The prison separation was a decade of slow time, measured in letters and the changing seasons outside a barred window. Bumpy Johnson, the king of Harlem, became inmate number 79134. He aged. The world he had controlled became a distant memory, a kingdom he could only visit through Mamie's weekly letters. October 12, 1973. My dearest Ellsworth, the autumn leaves are turning in St. Nicholas Park. It's beautiful, but not the same without you to walk with me. Junie keeps things in order. He says the streets are quieter now, but it's a nervous quiet. The Italians from downtown are pushing farther north. The old respect is gone. They are like that man, Volpe. All greed, no honor. I visited with Joe last month. He's living quietly in Las Vegas. His health is not good, but his mind is clear. He asked about you. He called you a righteous man. He remembers what you did. Everyone does. Bumpy would read her letters over and over, the thin paper becoming soft and worn. He worked in the prison library, surrounded by books, a quiet, dignified old man the other inmates gave a wide berth. He was a legend even here. He read philosophy, history, poetry. He reflected on his life, on the violence and the grace, the contradictions of his own code. He had lived as a criminal to enforce a moral order the law could not. May 3, 1977. Ellsworth, Harlem is changing so much. The city is broke. The buildings are burning in the Bronx. Heroin is everywhere. It's a plague, my love. It's taking the young men. The community you protected feels like it's crumbling. Junie does his best, but you were the glue that held it all together. Your name is still spoken with respect, like a king in exile. They tell stories about you, about what you did for the champ. He saw the pictures she sent. His Harlem, his kingdom, ravaged by a systemic decay he was powerless to stop. The letters were a slow, painful chronicle of his own fading relevance. He was becoming a story, a myth. April 13, 1981. My love, I have sad news. Joe passed away yesterday. A heart attack. The whole world is mourning him. The president is speaking at his funeral. They are calling him a great American hero. They don't know the half of it. They don't know about the island or the darkroom. But we do. You did right by him, Ellsworth. You kept his legacy clean to the very end. May he rest in peace. Bumpy held the letter in his cell. He didn't cry. He felt a profound, quiet sorrow. He had gone to prison for this man, and now the man was gone. He looked out the window at the flat, endless Kansas sky. He had traded 10 years of his life for a principle. He wondered, in the silence of his cell, if it had been worth it. December 18, 1981 / the gates of Leavenworth. He was released on a cold, gray morning, an old man with thinning hair and a suit that was 10 years out of style. He had served nearly a decade. He was 66 years old. Junie Bird was waiting for him outside the gates, standing beside a black Lincoln Town car. Junie was grayer, heavier, his face lined with the stress of holding a crumbling empire together. They embraced, a long, silent hug between two men who had been through a war together. "Welcome home, Bumpy," Junie said, his voice rough with emotion. The drive back to New York was quiet. Bumpy just stared out the window, watching the country fly by. It was a different world. The cars were smaller, the music was different. When they finally crossed into the city, the sight of the skyline, changed as it was, made his chest ache. But it was Harlem that broke his heart. Mamie's letters had prepared him, but the reality was worse. The decay was visible, a physical rot. Burned-out buildings stood like hollowed-out teeth. The streets were dirtier, the faces more desperate. The plague of heroin was everywhere, in the nodding figures in doorways, in the hollowed-out eyes of the youth. Junie drove him to his old apartment building on St. Nicholas Avenue. It was still standing, a bulwark against the tide of decay. And Mamie was there, waiting for him at the curb. She looked older, more fragile, but her eyes were the same. They held each other for a long time. Right there on the sidewalk, two old lovers reunited at the end of the world. There were no words to say. Their shared history, the letters, the long years of waiting, said it all. December 24th, 1981/Woodlawn Cemetery, the Bronx. A few days later, Bumpy asked Junie to drive him to the cemetery. He wanted to pay his respects. He stood before the simple gravestone. Joseph Louis Barrow, 1914 to 1981, the Brown Bomber. Snow was beginning to fall, small, soft flakes that melted on the cold granite. Bumpy stood there for a long time, his hat in his hands, the cold wind whipping at his coat. He had done his time. The man he did it for was here, under the frozen ground. The world he had fought to protect was disappearing. He felt the sting of futility. As he stood there, lost in thought, an old man walking through the cemetery with his grandson stopped nearby. The old man, a Harlem resident Bumpy vaguely recognized from decades ago, stared at him for a long moment. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice hesitant. Are you Mr. Johnson?" Bumpy turned. He nodded slowly. "I am." The old man's face broke into a wide, respectful smile. He took his grandson by the shoulder. "See," he said to the boy, who was no older than 10. "I told you. That's him. That's Bumpy Johnson." He turned back to Bumpy, his eyes shining with an old memory and a fierce pride. "I was there, Mr. Johnson. The night of the parade for the second Schmeling fight. My father put me on his shoulders. The whole of Harlem was out. It felt like we owned the world that night. Because of him," he nodded toward the grave, "and because of men like you who looked out for us." The man tipped his hat. "Welcome home, sir." He guided his grandson away, leaving Bumpy alone again in the falling snow. Bumpy looked from the old man back to the grave, and in that moment, he understood. It hadn't been for nothing. The buildings could crumble, the streets could decay, but the story remained. The legacy was safe. It lived on in the memories of old men, passed down to their grandsons. He hadn't just saved a man, he had preserved a feeling. The feeling of that night in Harlem, when a black man was the king of the world, and for a moment, anything seemed possible. He put his hat back on and turned to leave. He had come home not to a kingdom of streets and buildings, but to a kingdom of memory. And here, at least, he still reigned. The reunion was complete. It was not a payoff of power or wealth, but of purpose. A young man, a groundskeeper, passed him on the path. He was a kid from the neighborhood, and he recognized the legend before him. He nodded his head, his eyes full of a respect that transcended time. "Mr. B," he said, a simple, profound acknowledgement. Not pop, but something just as familial. A name that meant patriarch, protector, king. Bumpy Johnson nodded back, a faint smile on his lips, and walked toward the waiting car, a ghost of Harlem returning to his place in the story.